Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Coding Revolution, how Africa's tech wizards are changing the world. My name is Eweniyi, and I'm co-founder and CEO of PiggyVest. PiggyVest is a fintech company in Nigeria, and for the past 5 or 6 years, we've worked on automated savings and investments for the African millennial. Our work is basically targeted at allowing people work and save their way to financial freedom for as little as they want. But for the purpose of this session, I will, of course, identify as an African tech wizard. A few quick reminders before we get started. There is English to French interpretation available for this session, and you can get access instructions in the session description. We will also be reserving some time for Q&As towards the end of the session. So please, as we go along and keep discussing, send in your questions, and I promise that we will get to as many as we can. This session will also be recorded and available on demand here in the Attendee Hub later. So if you missed something, you can go back, or if you have a friend who missed something, feel free to share the link with them. Now, before we get started, there's three awesome people on the panel with me today, and the organizers have done something pretty incredible. We've shot videos that would allow you kind of frame what each person does and have good context, right? So first video coming up is for Solomon King. Solomon is the founder of BondiBots, and BondiBots is basically intervening by working with schools and communities in Uganda, right, Solomon? Yeah, in Uganda, to provide hands-on practical STEM and science education in classrooms and communities, using everything from helping students build robots to general coding and project-based learning to help them engage and get well-rounded science technology education. So here's Solomon and BondiBots video.
Hello, my name is Athena. I am an interactive robot designed to tell you the story of FundiBots.
When a kid learns robotics, their minds are completely opened up. As a child, I loved tinkering. I loved building machines, taking machines apart. The biggest problem that I see with science education in Uganda and most of Africa is that we're basically teaching students to memorize information as opposed to teaching them to be scientists. Science is about exploration, it's about curiosity, it's about experimentation. That was a sort of catalyst for thinking about a space where kids could be advised, mentored, and guided without restriction. The idea behind BondiBots is finding interesting ways of improving learning in a practical, relevant, and project-based way that creates innovative mindsets. We believe in students being change makers and innovators. We are always asking them, how can you use this technology to transform the world around you? There's a joy and wonder in little kids' faces when a light bulb goes on because they created the circuit. That moment for us is extremely beautiful. Many universities are not teaching the practical skills that students should be learning. Our internship program is a subset of our skills and careers program.
I'm working on an infrared sensor robot.
I'm working on a self-balancing robot.
Fundi Girls is basically our program for creating equitable access to learning in Uganda. It doesn't matter who you are, where you come from. You can be an excellent engineer, you can be an excellent scientist, and you can change the world. We currently have 2 main spaces in Kampala, Eastern Uganda, and we're opening up our 3rd one in Northern Uganda. My heart is in solving education in Africa.
Right. And now I'm going to introduce to you Thembiso from Social Coding. Thembiso is a former banker and now a social impact entrepreneur. And she is now helping rural communities leverage technology for a better future via social coding. Social coding is providing digital training to young people between the ages of 14 to 34 and helping them excel academically, pursue a career in ICT, or use existing technology to grow their local businesses. Again, here's social coding and Thembiso.
You know, when I think about the challenges that this community faces, my biggest thing is the fact that they have lack of access to knowledge, to communication, to internet. And that affects them like in a lot of ways, right? When we think of our matriculant students, for example, some of them can't even apply for university because they have to travel 2.5 hours outside of this community, go to an internet cafe that only has like 5 computers, pay 25 Rand per every 15 minutes, and you think to yourself, how can someone do that? Particularly someone that's never touched a computer before, right? So when you're faced with a community like that, the obvious thought is, how do I help?
There is a lot of potential in Mashite. It's just that I think the people here have limited themselves. They've just thought to themselves that they're in the rural areas and this is where they end. But I think if they can try to fly high, you know, there is a lot of potential here.
The students are lacking resources like laptops and then apparatus for science subjects and also chemicals, yes, for these practicals.
Social coding has embarked on a new journey of seeing, can we use virtual reality to teach empathy, right? When we look at putting a headset on a learner, showcasing a small business and asking them to help find the problems, they're not just viewing, you know, the small business's operations through a 1D lens. They're viewing it through an immersive experience. They're seeing the challenges that the small business owner is going through, and hopefully they can relate to that in such a way that when you take the headsets off and you ask them to find a solution for it, because they can feel what they saw, they're more incentivized to find a solution for it. What did you think about the VR experience?
Thank you, and that was social coding and Thembiso. Now I'm introducing to you Wiza from ChipperCash. Wiza is arguably the most connected person in the African tech ecosystem, and he's almost always only 2 degrees of separation from anyone you need to know. So I personally met Wiza in 2018, and since then, he has leveraged that connectedness to build a career in service of financial inclusion. Wiza currently works as the VP of Global Developer Relations at ChipperCash, and he is currently enabling developers all over the world to build on top of the Chipper Network API platform, amongst many other things that he's doing. So here's Wiza and his work at ChipperCash.
Creating for the internet, I think, is a big part of my identity and a big part of who I am. All of the different things that I'm doing today are centered around what is possible because of the internet and how can I create the most impact through using the tools that are available to me through the internet. Hi, I'm Wiza Jalakasi. I'm a Malawian living between South Africa and Kenya, and I am an internet creator. So all of the work that I do at Chipper, at the various venture capital funds that I work with, and in the cryptocurrency ecosystem is all centered around what can we do to make the world a better place with the maximum impact that we can reasonably afford. What cryptocurrency represents is potentially an opportunity for us to facilitate cross-border trade between African nations without having to rely on currencies that we don't own. And I think this would be a fantastic step in the right direction towards Africa gaining its own economic sovereignty within the global economic system. I am Vice President of Global Developer Relations at ChipperCash. ChipperCash is a smartphone app that is used by over 4.2 million people in 7 African countries, as well as the UK and the US, to move money across borders. It's very similar to technologies like M-Pesa, Airtel Money, and MTN Mobile Money in many African countries, except that it is smartphone first, and we have a bunch of cool features that you typically wouldn't find on traditional mobile money platforms. For example, in countries like Nigeria and Uganda, we allow users to be able to participate in the US stock exchange by purchasing fractions of US stocks. We also have a virtual card feature, so you get like a virtual Visa or MasterCard, which is tied to your Chipra wallet, and then you can use that at global merchants online everywhere. We're about to launch physical cards too, so very soon we'll allow users to be able to purchase goods and services in physical stores using their cards. Internet adoption in Africa is still very low, so I can't imagine how exciting it's going to be when all of us have access and can participate in the global internet economy.
So you've now met our 3 panelists, Solomon, Thembiso, and Wiza. And so we'll go straight into the panel. We have interesting questions for these 3 people centered around 3 very important themes: intersection and collaboration, coding, tech, or VR as empathy or plugging into empathy, and like the future, basically. Okay, that last theme is very broad, but you'll see when we get there. Right, so I'm going to go straight into it, right? I've worked in tech personally for about 8 years, since 2013. But one of the key things that no one really ever talks about is why. What is your why? Why did you decide to go into tech? Solomon, why are you building BondiBots? Thembiso, why social coding? And Wiza, why people relations? So I'm just going to start with Solomon. Why did you decide to do this?
Thank you so much. So first of all, I am a nerd. I absolutely love tech. I think it's in my blood. I've been fascinated by tech ever since I was a child. My cousins have this running memory that is not very flattering, but it's basically a memory of me looking through rubbish bins and rubbish skips, looking for tech, like broken radios and broken cassette players, just so that I could understand it. So tech for me has always been very fascinating. I don't think I needed a why at all. It's just something that I was born with. But now I'm trying to figure out how to instill that same sort of excitement into the children that we work with. So my why is just that I was born a geek, man, and that's it.
Right. And Thembiso, why social coding? I mean, you worked in banking, and for all intents and purposes, a few years ago, banking was, well, a better career path than tech. So why did you decide to leave it?
Yeah, thank you so much. And I just want to say, I want to thank the Siegel Foundation for giving me an excuse to wear a jacket today. I know you can't all see it, but I'm very excited about this. But to answer your question, essentially, I started social coding from a very selfish point in the beginning. I did it for my niece. My niece was just celebrating her 6th birthday and had asked her, what do you want for your birthday? I know this is a famous story that I always tell, but she said she wants to be Steve Jobs, right? And obviously the first thought that comes to my mind is, why do you want to be an old white man? And she says to me, no, it's not about him, but it's about what he did. Innovation, making the world a better place. And that's something that I want to do. And I want to do that through coding. And at the time, I had no clue what coding was, but I had to learn because I wanted my niece to achieve that goal. So essentially, social coding started as a safe space for young Black girls to learn about coding, but it has morphed into something greater than that right now. You know, we pivoted to ensure that there would be digital parity for everyone, not just people like my niece, but more importantly, rural communities and learners that come from those communities. So essentially my why is equality. It is digital parity for all.
Right. I'm going to, circle back to Solomon here for a minute. So, I mean, you've just told us why you went into tech, but Thembiso just brought up a very important motivation why she started social coding. So, I mean, you went into tech because it's just where your heart is. But why did you start FundiBots? Why was it important that you start something that helped kids appreciate tech?
So that is very firmly rooted in the frustrations that I faced when I was young. So all of this dumpster diving is basically me looking for answers, and I wanted to find those answers in the world around me, but there was no one to guide me basically. So I spent most of my primary school and secondary school a very frustrated child because I wanted to explore science and technology, but I lived in an era without internets. There were no books that I could refer to. School was just a frustration of exam after exam. And so FundiBots for me was basically the result of those frustrations. I had this hope and belief as a child that there could be space for something like this where kids are encouraged to shine, to thrive, to grow, to be mentored and nurtured. Thankfully, I built up enough resources to get the first step done, and then I met amazing partners like Seal Family Foundation that then allowed me to bring that vision fully to life. So all I'm trying to do basically is to sort of reach back into the past and find that little child and tell them that yes, there is hope for you, and I know that there are thousands of those kids across Uganda and across the African continent.
Thank you, Solomon. That's perfect. So, Wiza, I'm going to come to you. I'm like I said, I met you in 2018, and you've pretty much been acting as a connector for people across the African tech ecosystem. Cannot count how many intros that you've made that have turned into like big deals for several people, and we always hear it being spoken about. And so you're slightly different than Solomon and Thembiso here in that like your work is mostly with people. It's in tech, but what you're doing is making Africa a lot less smaller, a lot less big, sorry. And so my question is mostly why that, right? You've worked in different companies, but like your work has underlying themes that are the same. Why is it important to you that people be connected, like even as you work around financial services, crypto, and all other like similar themes?
Yeah, thank you, Odun. I think the biggest thing for me is that, like, I've realized that, like, from perhaps a position of privilege, I've been able to see quite a number of different African societies, major cities, and like previously, I used to think that like we were very different from each other on the continent. And you travel around and you start to see that, like, oh, people have the same motivations, thinking, direction, and intentions. But what varies is like maybe the language that they speak or some other cultural factors. But all in all, like we're all working towards the same thing. And then, like I'll be sitting sometimes in Nairobi, coming across something that like somebody in Kampala can be able to solve, somebody in Lagos can be able to solve. And I started to realize that, like, because of my positioning and visibility into various activities in the ecosystem, I have a lot of information that others may not have. And I was like, okay, how do I optimize people's productivity by connecting them to other people who might be on a similar path? And I guess it's like a natural function of like me being a social being that has enabled me to do that. But it's been like really rewarding to see the outcomes in various ways. And on the flip side of that, the impact that we're able to create in the technology sector by building out great products, you're immediately almost always at scale. So like, I can be writing something right now from my hotel room in Los Angeles, and it's going to be used by millions of people tomorrow. And there's nothing that I've found that enables me to extend my hand in such a way. So definitely those are the reasons why I do what I do.
Great answer, thank you. So, common themes around the answers that we've had here is childhood frustrations, which is very pertinent. Just seeing young girls not know, like there is not enough representation, and we're going to get to that. And the last thing is knowing that people are a bit more similar than they know, and wanting to show that to them. So, the next question I wanted to ask was we've spoken about our motivations, our why, and audience has gotten a chance to watch the what. So now I want to go to the how, right? How are we doing this, and how, like, what is stopping us from doing it? We're all Africans here, and one thing about an African entrepreneur, the average African entrepreneur, is that not only are you building your company, you're running, as I love to say, you're running a mini country where you're providing a lot of your own infrastructure. So how has that been for you? Like, what's along this journey have you discovered is working well, and what has been frustrating? Right, running FundiBots, you're like creating an environment, Solomon, where kids are able to like work with robots. That's not cheap. Electricity, we know, is not stable. Transportation, logistics, and all of that. So, what's been the experience so far? And I want to hear a bit more about the frustrations and how you've been able to overcome them.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really tough one. I could talk all day about our frustrations. But I think for us, really, the toughest thing has always been in two main categories. One is the logistics, basically being able to get parts in here. So, for example, because of COVID, it takes us on average 3 to 8 weeks to get any sort of goods in, or during a time before COVID, it would take us about, if it takes a long time, maybe it's 2 weeks max. But now we have such massive delays in shipping. We've had a lot of our production cycles extended simply because we can't get the parts in time. But the really tough problem for us comes around things like infrastructure and basically utilities, yeah, right? So if you're a tech-based company, then you know that the internet is vital to what you're doing. So for as long as you have unstable internet, as long as you have unstable electricity, it becomes really, really hard to provide any meaningful tech education. So the big challenge for us, like you mentioned earlier, that sometimes you're trying to solve a problem and then you find yourself addressing the entire ecosystem. So the big challenge for us is like, when we go to a school, do we have enough resources to actually do the training, and not just for the time that we are there? How do we then allow this? How do we then create opportunities for students to continue learning beyond us? Do they have the hardware they need? Do they have stable electricity? What does internet look like? So we find ourselves trying to solve so many problems that ideally should be government level infrastructure issues. You're providing internet bundles simply because the school cannot afford internet, or there's no option for them to get fiber, or you're trying to figure out whether you need to buy a generator and put it in a car every single time you go to visit, because you're like, okay, so does the school that I'm going to have electricity? And even if it does, you might find that on the day that you are scheduled to be there, there's no electricity for the entire day. So the frustrations are numerous, and I think for us it's just a problem where we have to keep pushing forward regardless, because every day that we lose is literally thousands of classroom hours wasted. And so for us, there's this urgency about the children, especially deep in the villages, the children that will never have these opportunities unless we actually provide them. Every single year, every single month that passes, there's a child that's being left behind simply because we've been unable to reach them. So there is an urgency. The frustrations are there, but we keep pushing forward regardless of the frustrations and the limitations.
Thank you, Solomon. So when you were speaking earlier, Thembiso, I found it very interesting that the inspiration for starting social coding was your niece. So I have a sister who's just about 12 years old as well. And during the lockdown, we were having a conversation because we were sheltering in my place. And I asked her, she has an iPad, she has an iPhone, she has all the Apple devices. But I asked her, like, who's the founder of Apple? Right. And she had no idea. And I found that very surprising. And then I continued to quiz her about the founders of all the popular tech companies. And I thought that was a problem. And so we had to I didn't start a whole company, but we had to start a whole lesson plan by teaching her the basics of tech. And I found it's very important that you started social coding from that, because one of the ways that we realize tech goes is that the pipeline gets narrower as you go to the top, right? At the
Yeah.
baseline of it, you have girls like my sister, girls like your cousin, and your niece, not knowing and just not being involved because there isn't enough representation at the top. Right? And I wanted to dig into that a bit. How has it been starting girl social coding as a way to inspire Black girls to get more into tech? There is several ways that we're all trying to get women into tech. There's programs targeted at it, but social coding is doing it in a very unique way and targeting girls in rural communities who would otherwise not have the opportunity. What has that experience been like? What is it like uplifting these women to make sure that we are trying to push the pipeline apart and push these girls up the ladder?
Yeah, I think the first lesson that I had to learn was that it's a bit problematic if you are approaching this from a representation only perspective, right? Because unfortunately, we're not there yet. It doesn't matter how many conversations I have with my niece about representation, she still doesn't see it. So we kind of had to change the narrative in terms of, okay, if you don't see yourself mirrored in that industry, perhaps it's time that you actively work towards taking space up in that industry, right? And we had, and Solomon brought up a very, very good point in terms of how multifaceted this work is. You set out trying to solve one problem and you don't realize how many other problems are connected to this. So in the work that we do, particularly in rural communities, I set out to teach girls about digital revolution, and I encountered issues about self-confidence, right? I encountered issues where girls didn't feel smart enough to be in tech because, you know, when you grow up and you always answer questions, the backlash is teacher's pet, right? And subconsciously, what I saw, particularly with my high school girls, is those that were energetic and would ask questions in primary level, that backlash of being called teacher's pets, right? Subconsciously, it hit them so much that they didn't even realize that they no longer were putting their hands up for opportunities, right? And in the work that we're doing, technology is so multifaceted that it doesn't only stop with the innovation itself. It brings about all these different layers that we had to be intentional about addressing. So when we speak about representation, it's a battle, yes, but what can we do right now? Right now, we can make space for girls to unequivocally be, confident in their intelligence. And we do that by ensuring that in competitions, they are the ones that are leading groups, right? We try to make it incredibly important for men, for young boys to see that a woman in leadership is not a threat to their masculinity, right? And we do that by encouraging partnership. We do that by encouraging co-directorship, right? So we have this thing where we have drivers and navigators in our programs. So when they're doing a coding project together, we like to have both male and females in leadership so that they can see that cooperation is possible without it being a risk to another one. Because now what we're taught is that by giving females space, by giving them more, we are making men less, right? And that shouldn't be the dialogue. So social coding's hope, particularly when we're looking at that talent pipeline that you were talking about, is let's start by answering the things we can do now. Let's start with the softer version. Yes, the technical aspects, the coding workshops, the digital workshops are important, but those must be aligned with also leadership skills. They must also be aligned with how do we bridge about gender equality, right? And teach that in these communities by assuring young boys that the raising up of girls doesn't mean the lowering of themselves.
Perfect. That was a perfect answer. And Wiza, so you work as VP Global Developer Relations, which means that your work is more than Nigeria, it's more than South Africa, more than Malawi, more than Africa. So that means that you've had a chance front seat really to how the rest of the world is leveraging some of the opportunities. Now, Solomon is in robotics, Thembiso is in education. How do you think that Africa as a continent can leverage some of the opportunities that you must have come across in your work for Cheaper Cash so far?
Yeah, that's a great question, Odun. Thank you. I think there's, obviously many different directions that we could take things. But that one thing that has been resonating very strongly with me as of late is just around how much creativity and productivity that internet access grants to young Africans. I think those of us who are fortunate enough to have access to electricity and a reliable internet connection, we've been able to build something of ourselves to some extent that we otherwise might not have been able to, and that applies to all of us who are working so closely in the technology space. It's enabled by that fundamental infrastructure layer. And what's been interesting to observe more recently is a transition to audiences and how people can start to monetize those audiences. So it started first with social media that I think has been growing quite a bit over the last few years across the continent. But also, now it's incredibly easy for somebody to set up like a newsletter online, charge subscribers for their knowledge. And I do see like quite a lot of interesting creativity that's popping up on platforms with built-in monetization. So, one of my favorite people to see online is Kabi Lame. He's a TikToker from Senegal, who I think has got like one of the highest follower counts in the world and makes videos without like actually saying a word. And somebody like that, having an audience of millions across various platforms, has a unique opportunity to be able to monetize that audience. And you often find that like that audience is willing to pay, and all of us probably have some subsets of audiences that are willing to actually compensate us for the content and other things that we create on the internet. But the biggest challenge is getting paid, right? So if you look at card, it's only Thembiso who's enjoying life in South Africa where card penetration is relatively high. And you can send out your link to like a web-based payment gateway and people will be able to pay you with their card. But you are doing when you're in Lagos and you're trying to get paid amounts of $120 at a time. Solomon, when you're in Kampala and you're trying to get paid by people who are in China or people who are in the US, like those rails don't exist. And a very big part of like why I really enjoy what I do is being able to see like the fundamental ways in which you're enabling economic opportunity by building something as simple and as trivial as a payment rail. Um, it's it's difficult to quantify some of the impact that is being created with these types of plays, this like infrastructure plays, because the results are very like compounding, and you only get to see after a long period of time what you've actually done. I know, Dun, you can relate to this. You're helping millions of people in Nigeria and beyond to be able to save money and to be able to understand, like, just from a psychological perspective, what it actually means to create wealth, especially when there's no like baseline comparable. I mean, African countries as institutions, as ideas, have not existed for more than 60, 70 years at most. So it's really quite pivotal, the role that having our own infrastructure to move money around, to be able to process payments in the age of the internet. It's difficult to overstate how critical this is, because I think it enables an entire generation of young people who perhaps might not have access to traditional opportunities through employment. Youth unemployment is very high in countries where we're from. It gives them like an alternative path, right? And I think that's something worth thinking through and worth focusing more and more intently, because we are now in competition with the world. Our creators in Africa are competing with creators from all over the world who might have different advantages when it comes to infrastructure, but we certainly don't lack for creativity or talent. And it just feels good to be able to even the score.
Right. I really like that answer because it touches a lot on where I wanted the conversation to go next. Right. So, we are now in competition with the world. There's never been a time that's been truer. But what is different, I suppose, between entrepreneurs in Africa and creators in Africa and the rest of the world is how and what we are using the tech for. In the West, you can argue that they use tech for tech's sake. We don't have that luxury. I remember the first ever call that this group had. Thembiso said she uses social coding uses VR to teach empathy, right? I don't think that there's anyone outside of Africa who would quite make that sentence because most people use VR for fun, right? So I was going to ask each one of us, how is your work using tech to make social change? And it's not because I think that social change should be the end for all tech entrepreneurs. It's because I think that African entrepreneurs don't have much of a choice when it comes to this period that we're in. All of your work in tech, at Cheaper Cash, at PiggyVest, at BondiBots, at social coding, is geared towards changing something that's not good because right now, Africans are still building the baseline for what our own tech revolution looks like. So the question I'm asking is, how is your work using tech to make social change? I'll start with you, Thembiso, as inspiration.
One of the earliest lessons that I learned when I started out this journey is that it's so easy for you as a social entrepreneur to get caught up in this hero story, right? There is a problem, you want to solve it, and you want to do it in the most extraordinary way. Because deep down, you want to save the day. And one of the first lessons that I learned is that you must never go to a community from a point of your want, but you must meet them at a point of their need, right? And I learned that because when we came and we advertised teaching coding, for example, none of the learners were interested in doing that, right? They're not interested in building the next Facebook. They're not interested in building the next Google. These are learners that want to be able to switch a computer on. They want to be able to find information on the internet that they can use to either get into university or get jobs, right? So their basic need wasn't to fund the next 50 billion unicorn, but it was just to help where they're at. And with that lesson in mind, I decided that, whatever technologies that we bring into our digital training, it has to do the same thing. It has to be able to help them leverage for their own social benefit. And one of the things that I came across with virtual reality is its ability to transport the user, right? And I thought that was a phenomenal thing. You rightly mentioned that right now, the major use for virtual reality is for gaming, right? But we found that we could use it to transport learners, particularly during COVID, because with COVID, there was no traveling, right? We had learners who have never left their village. They live 50 to 150 miles away from the nearest town. They haven't even traveled that far, right? And we wanted to say, is it possible to take this learner out of their immediate environment and transport them in such a way that it affects their behavior and it gives them a desire for social change? And we tested this out when we decided to come up with the concept of introducing learners to and give them the ability to be transported into someone's business, right? The idea was when you put on the VR headsets and you experience, let's say, a tour of a small business owner's bakery or a small business owner's kiosk, you would be able to pick up what certain problems are in that environment, right? But the idea was to take you beyond the problem and to think about the consequences of that problem. So if you are in a virtual environment of a baker who isn't making enough money because she is not doing her inventory correctly, the idea was that you'd be able to relate to that in such a way that once you take those headsets off, you're immediately jotting down and critical thinking is the basis of empathy, right? If we could get the learners to empathize better, they would then be able to look for solutions and probably solve them much better because they can relate to it. And that is what virtual reality allows us to do. It allows us to walk a mile in another person's shoes. And hopefully, because we can relate to those shoes, we are better suited to find a solution.
Thank you, Thembiso. That was a very comprehensive answer. So Solomon, same question to you.
So for us, tech is a means to an end. Even though we are teaching tech, at the end of the day, for us, it's a tool that can, I like to think of the internet, for example, as a great equalizer. It's basically this one thing that can be accessible to everyone, and it's this wonderful repository of knowledge. And as long as you create a means through which people learn how to access knowledge. I like the saying that a teacher is not necessarily a master, but just someone who opens the door and allows students to explore the world around them. So if we are able to create opportunities where students learn how to learn, then everything else becomes a really, really powerful bonus. So for us, our goal as an organization is, because we are working in the education space, our goal as an organization is to be obsolete, because if the government is teaching science education well, then there is no reason for us to exist. So a lot of our work is around systems change. It's around education reform. So even though we are doing robotics, we still have an element where we are addressing the school curriculum directly. So we will have accomplished our mission if we are no longer needed. But at the same time, we also understand that we are working on multiple layers of intervention. There is addressing the baseline problem that science education is falling way behind in Africa. You basically have an education system where students are basically being passed along a conveyor belt, right? So that you're born, you get onto that conveyor belt, and at the end of that journey, you're given a piece of paper that says that you're now an expert at this. But that piece of paper in many African contexts is not representative of, one, the actual learning that has happened, or two, the actual learning that needs to happen, right? So that piece of paper is representative of a certain abstract identifier for learning, but we want to create an environment where the learning that happens is intrinsic. The learning that happens is so powerful that the student actually comes away with a deeper desire to learn, not just a desire to complete the project or to complete an exam. So we are tackling this across so many areas. We are working in the schools. We are working with extracurricular activities in the classroom. We are working in preparing students for the workforce in the STEM space. We are now exploring what home-based learning looks like. But all of this has to be done in a really complex environment where it's very limited resource-wise and where there are lots of challenges that we face. So even though we want to be obsolete, we do understand that we still have a very long journey ahead of us. And the empathy for us in this particular question is understanding that there's a huge disparity in equity. You have kids who are living outside Africa, and for them robotics is about going to a store and picking up a Lego kit and assembling it, and you don't even need to do much. Whereas the kids that we work with, they have never seen anything that we are describing, right? So we have to do so much intervention across so many different tiers of equity that empathy then becomes an active decision to understand the audience that you are working with. Is it a girl? And I really loved the conversation earlier on girls, because we have a very strong Fundi girls program as well. So the empathy is: are you working with girls? What is it like within their context? Are you working with kids in the villages? What is it like within their context? The solution that you provide for a child who has access to the internet cannot be the same level of solutions that you provide to the kids deep in the villages. So we are hoping to create a renewed perspective for education, but one that I like to call purpose-driven learning, which basically means that there is a reason why you're studying all of this, and you understand it very clearly, as opposed to this abstract concept that you go into a classroom, sit in front of a blackboard and just listen to someone speak and then regurgitate that in an exam. We're trying to create more purpose to the learning, more empathy to the audiences that we engage, and that means we do a lot of experimentation. But thankfully, the word Fundi in our name is basically a very nice word that translates across very many African
context. So it's tinkerer, craftsman, teacher. So we are basically sort of in the right space to try and figure out solutions. Yeah.
To foster equality, and Thembiso is using it to foster empathy in kids. And so we have those two things, which are great crystallizations of how both of them are working on social change. So, Wiza, same question for you. How's your work? And, I don't think you need to like focus on cheaper cash alone. It can be like through the breadth of it, using tech for social change.
Thank you, Odun. I think I've got a two-part answer. So, on the chipper side, it's just really fundamental, I think, for people to have access to the global financial system. As I am today, being a Malawian who's got the ability to travel across Africa, I'm in the United States right now. Like, I still feel financially excluded. There's so many things that I can get access to, like my parents have been asking me for like alternative investment options in Malawi, and it's like, okay, I can invest in land, but like we can't invest in stocks, global stocks, right? And it's like we are the lucky ones, we are the privileged ones, and when you start to think about how the extent to which you have access to these types of opportunities compounds over generations, it is very clear to see that it doesn't make sense that like an entire generation of people should be unable and completely unexposed to certain types of like financial products. So, being able to reduce that barrier to entry, barrier to access, for the first time for very many people, really fills me with a strong sense of fulfillment and warmth, that we are actually contributing to making the world better. Apart from that, like, I spend a lot of my time connecting people for investment opportunities. So amongst the various many hats that you wear or doing, I don't know if people know that you're also a partner at First Check Africa, who are an early stage venture fund, specifically focusing on women and women of color, to be that first round of venture capital in. And now I remember the first time I ever was involved in raising money. It took 9 months to raise $30,000. And for context, now at Chip, I think we've raised like over 150 million in the space of a few years. But like, I know how difficult it is for that first check to be written. And like, I'm a man, so it's even easier, right? Like, so to be able to, play a role in bridging people to opportunities, opportunities that can enable them to actually maximize the most of their access, the most of their privilege. The few of us that actually do get a chance to try some of these things, I think that also trickles down to a vast majority of people in very many interesting ways. So those two are things that are very close to my heart, and I have infinite energy for doing. I think like also storytelling is a very important thing that we could all get better at, to not only inspire young people, but to provide frames of reference for what it might look like when somebody from like a young person in Malawi is making it in tech. When I was starting out in my career, I used to find it very challenging to have high aspirations because they weren't like symbols I could look up to who looked like me and came from the place that I did. That I could look up to and say like, hey, I can be like that person one day. And a big part of the work that I do nowadays is around storytelling. Where I'm here right now, despite it being 3:39 a.m. for me, all of the writing that I've been doing over the past few years is just centered around making sure that people get access to examples that are relatable. And I think that like it's difficult to measure what impact and how that impact is created. But when I have conversations with people, these things add up and are able to change their life trajectory in a very meaningful way. And you know, I guess there's no stats and numbers you can apply to measure this types of stuff, but it really is, in my view, absolutely critical. And I feel very privileged to be able to leverage tech in driving that.
Perfect. So I loved your answer because it did inspire one other question, but we have questions coming in from the audience now, so I'm just going to float that up because we're almost running out of time. So Wiza says, you know, he's leveraging tech to reduce the barriers and to show examples because, as we all know, representation matters. And I will say that Tanzania is like really represented in the summit today because out of 4 questions I'm looking at, 3 are about like people in Tanzania wanting or having questions about what we're talking about. So Solomon and Thembiso, there's about 3 questions here for both of you, asking relatively the same things. Your projects are amazing and they're very needed. Number 1, and you can answer these questions between both of you. What's the response of the government of your countries to what you're doing? Are they getting involved? Are they helping you scale up? And secondly, when will either of you expand to Tanzania? So 2 people have asked, you know, what's the government's response? Are they helping you scale up? Are they helping you integrate your programs into the formal education space? And 1 person wants to know, how can you get those ideas to rural Tanzania and all other places across Africa where there's a dearth of electricity, water, classes, and all the other factors that we need to make this successful? So I'm just going to give each of you 90 seconds. Sorry. So Thembiso, we'll start with you.
Oh my God. Still getting used to, you know, the whole virtual thing again. Solomon, I am not touching the question on governments. That is your question to answer. I am not touching that with the poll, but I will say this, right? And it goes to what Solomon had mentioned earlier in terms of the goal being to be obsolete. I don't think that will ever happen, right? And I'll say, not that I'm negative, I'll say this because government needs our help, right? The government needs communities, it needs nonprofits, it needs for-profit companies to come together to work towards these goals. Because if we are ever going to achieve the goals, the ambitions that we have set for ourselves, not only as individual countries, but as continents, we need to partner and we need to collaborate. So that's all I'm saying on the government issue. In terms of scale, you know, that is the dream. Obviously, the dream is to be able to build something that is impactful, sustainable, but more importantly, scalable enough for everyone to have that opportunity, right? If you look at social coding as a whole, we don't look at this as a South African initiative, but we look at it as a Pan-African initiative, right? Something that is without borders. And one of the things, the goals that we have is digital parity in 100,000 villages by 2045, right? And that is a massive goal, a goal that I cannot do alone. One of the things I am going to do after this is actually email Solomon to see where do we collaborate, where do we come together, because the vision is aligned. Our businesses might seem different and we might operate differently, but there is alignment in vision. So when we talk about scales and scaling to other countries, I think it's important to start with what is the movement, right? The movement currently is equal access for all, because we see how technology has benefited us. And can we bring that to rural communities? So I think we need to start with identifying a game-changing commitment, right? Like digital parity, and then putting non-financial as well as financial resources behind those goals, behind those commitments, and advocating for them. So you don't have to be part of a social coding or a BondiBots in Tanzania, but what you can do is start advocating. What you can do is start bringing awareness to the actual movement. Not the individual organizations, but the movement. And the movement is digital parity for all.
Thank you. Solomon, very briefly, please.
Yes, so government is complex. And I agree with you that even though we want to be obsolete, it is going to be an incredibly difficult journey, because the work that we're trying to do, again, is supposed to be done on a scale that a small organization like ours can handle. The specific question about government response to our work is that, one, the government officials that we've engaged absolutely love what we're doing. Many of them understand the challenges that are in the education space. Many of them understand the limitations. So every time we've had meetings or done demonstrations, it's been a very welcome response. There are political and policy and all sorts of issues that I will not go into right now. But one of the biggest drivers for influencing education on a government level is evidence. So basically, the short version is, if you say your idea works, then you need to prove that it works in a lot of contexts. You need to prove that it works in all sorts of scenarios. So the curriculum reform that would need to happen for our work to be integrated into the government process will take a significant number of years. So for us, instead of spending a lot of time building that evidence base, we're actually attacking it on multiple fronts. The first is that, yes, we have a specific program that's geared to enhance learning in the classroom. So this one is called the Enhanced Science, the FundiBots Enhanced Science Curriculum. And this is designed to plug directly into what the government mandates schools to teach, because we cannot change that, right? But we can boost it and we can augment it. So what we do is we create tools that teachers can use in the classroom, that students can use to create a very collaborative student-based learning model. And that is a pilot that was supposed to have started in March. So it began, and then COVID happened, and then all this chaos. So we are hoping to resume it next year in January. Once we have that as an evidence base, then it means that we can replicate those tools and test them in larger and larger numbers, to the extent that now we can have enough evidence. And we will definitely get partners from across Africa, because our mission is to accelerate science learning in Africa, not in Uganda. So we would like to test these tools across as many African countries as possible. Our biggest challenge, obviously, is that this stuff is really expensive. So anyone who's out there who can fund us for this, we're really happy to talk. But that is the sort of evidence that the government needs in order to scale this work. When will we expand to Tanzania? We have already been to Tanzania. We've done training in Arusha. We have also done training in Zanzibar. We don't have an office or a full presence anywhere outside of Africa, but we've been to Malawi, we've been to Rwanda, I've had a personal visit to Ghana. So we are exploring actual collaborations across Africa. I've been to South Africa, but not on a training basis. In terms of resource limitations, one of the ways that we are constantly looking at our work is to constantly ask ourselves this question: if we put this in a village in the middle of nowhere, will it work? Right? Do we have the power that we need? Do we have the internet that we need? So we are essentially refactoring some of our tools to work in low resource contexts. So that means that if we are basically testing so much that if it's successful, then we know that we can just drop a box of tools in the middle of a village and students can start learning. And that's the ideal goal.
Thank you so much. So we have only about 3 minutes left. I'm sorry, Amos, we might not be able to get to your question. But there is one last thing, right? Wiza touched on something when he was speaking earlier, which is the progress that the ecosystem has made. In 2013, $10,000 was a great seed round. In 2021, we have seed rounds going into $15 million here in Africa. So my last question for you guys, and you literally only have 60 seconds each, is one bold prediction for the future, right? Where do you see Africa, including your work, in the next 10 or 50 years? 60 seconds, Wiza, go.
Definitely, I think there's going to be a lot more prosperity. This narrative around poverty and other things that, we're all tired of. I think things are going to fundamentally change. It might not be instant, but it will happen. And when it does, I think the world should be ready for a reckoning.
Thank you, Wiza. Thembiso?
Collaborative efforts between non-profits, governments, and for-profit companies will bring digital equity and digital parity in 100,000 African villages by 2045.
Very, very precise. Thank you. And Solomon?
I see an education system that fuses traditional African education, which was sort of like, sitting around and listening to the village elder, fused with VR and highly individualized personal learning technology to help students learn at their individual levels, not at some abstract level.
So thank you, Solomon. Thank you, Wiza. Thank you, Thembiso. And thank you to everyone who's been listening. This has been how Africa's tech wizards are changing the world. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the summit. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.